The first thing I noticed was the smell. Hospitals always have that sharp tang of disinfectant, but here, there was something else. Something faint, almost sweet, that clung to the air like a memory trying to resurface. Think you know how this story ends? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales. I had just started my new job as a night shift janitor at St. Vincent's Hospital. It wasn't glamorous, but I didn't need glamour. I needed steady work, something to keep my hands and mind busy. I told myself it would be fine. Just keep your head down, do your job, and don't get involved in the strange little dramas hospitals are full of. The head janitor, Mr. Keating, was waiting for me by the service elevator when I arrived. He was a wiry man, maybe in his 60s, with tired eyes and a perpetual scowl. "You're late," he said without looking at his watch. I wasn't, but I didn't argue. Instead, I nodded and muttered something apologetic. He handed me a clipboard and rattled off instructions faster than I could process them. "Here's your route," he said, tapping the clipboard. "Sweep the main halls, mop where needed, empty bins. And for God's sake, don't leave streaks on the floors. People notice that stuff." I nodded again, clutching the clipboard like a lifeline. As Keating walked me through the routine, my eyes wandered around the dimly lit corridor. The floors were spotless, gleaming under the overhead lights. Too spotless, almost like nobody ever really walked on them. "And one more thing," Keating added abruptly, his voice dropping as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. "The West Wing, just stick to the main corridor. Don't mess around with room 104. Got it?" I blinked. "What's in 104? "Nothing you need to worry about." His tone was clipped, final. "Just stick to the route. You'll be fine." Before I could press further, he turned and disappeared into the elevator, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. I pushed the mop cart through the first hallway, trying to focus on the task at hand. The work itself was straightforward. Sweep, mop, repeat. The hospital was quiet, save for the occasional muffled sound of a monitor or a distant cough from the wards. But something felt off. Maybe it was the way the lights seemed to flicker for just a moment longer than they should, or how the air felt colder near certain doors, even though the building had central heating. Or maybe it was nothing, just my nerves, I told myself. First day jitters. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At one point, while emptying a trash bin outside the ICU, I caught a glimpse of a nurse passing by. She didn't look at me, but there was something odd about her walk, stiff and hurried, as if she was trying to get away from something. I finished my rounds on the first floor and moved to the second. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, like a whisper, coming from the West Wing. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Almost. As I neared the West Wing, I hesitated. The corridor stretched ahead, dimly lit and eerily quiet. At the far end, I could see room 104, its number painted neatly on the door. It looked no different from the others. I told myself to keep moving, stick to the main corridor like Keating said, but my curiosity tugged at me, and for a moment, I stood there, staring at the door. The clipboard in my hand felt heavier somehow, the silence pressing in around me. Then, from somewhere deep in the wing, a faint metallic clang echoed, sharp and quick. I tightened my grip on the cart handle, my heart beating just a little faster. First day nerves, I muttered under my breath, forcing a shaky laugh. I turned and walked back toward the elevator, trying not to look over my shoulder. But even as I moved away, I could still feel it, the subtle pull of room 104, like it was waiting for me to come back. The elevator doors opened with a faint ding, and I stepped out onto the second floor. It was even quieter up here, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain for any sound, no matter how small. My next stop was the break room, where Keating had told me I'd find the night shift manual. "Read it before your first full round," he'd said. "We don't have time for mistakes." The manual was sitting on the break room table, thick and worn, its cover faded from years of use. I flipped it open and skimmed the first page. The usual stuff: shift schedules, cleaning routes, and safety precautions. But as I kept reading, the tone of the instructions began to feel odd. "Always ensure room 104 remains locked after midnight. Never leave cleaning supplies unattended in the West Wing. If you hear unusual noises, report them immediately to the security desk." I frowned, reading the lines again to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. What counted as an unusual noise? And why was there such a specific rule about room 104? The manual didn't explain. Halfway through, I found a section titled Emergency Protocols. Most of it seemed standard: how to handle fire alarms, patient evacuations, and medical emergencies. But then there was a peculiar entry. "If you notice unfamiliar names on the cleaning roster, do not attempt to contact them. Notify Mr. Keating immediately." Unfamiliar names? What did that even mean? I sat back in the chair, trying to make sense of it. The instructions felt like they were written for a different kind of job, something more than just mopping floors and emptying trash bins. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe hospitals were just cautious by nature, and this was their way of keeping things organized. Before I could dwell on it further, the door creaked open, and a nurse stepped in. She was young, with dark circles under her eyes and a badge that read Nina. "You're the new guy?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Yeah," I said, holding up the manual, trying to get up to speed. She gave a tired smile. "Don't worry too much about it. Just follow the rules and you'll be fine." Her words weren't exactly reassuring, but before I could ask anything, her pager beeped, and she hurried out, muttering something about a patient in the ICU. Left alone, I returned to the manual, but the more I read, the less it made sense. There were sections that seemed oddly specific. "Do not clean room 104 unless explicitly instructed by Mr. Keating. Always double-check the supply closet before locking it for the night. If the West Wing's hallway lights flicker, wait for them to stabilize before proceeding." It was as if someone had written these rules with a particular purpose in mind, one they didn't want to explain. I closed the manual, feeling a little more uneasy than before. This wasn't just about keeping the hospital clean. There was something else going on here, something unspoken. The rest of the shift went by without much incident. I mopped the floors, emptied the bins, and restocked supplies. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At one point, while cleaning near the ICU, I noticed a clipboard hanging on the wall. It had a list of patient names, but there was one that stood out: T. Carter, room 104. I stared at the name, confused. Room 104 wasn't supposed to have any patients, was it? I thought about asking Nina or one of the other nurses, but something held me back. Instead, I went back to my cart and continued cleaning, all the while feeling the weight of that name in my mind. Later, as I was restocking the supply closet, I heard footsteps in the West Wing. They were soft, almost hesitant, like someone didn't want to be heard. I froze listening, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I peeked out into the hallway, but it was empty. The only thing I could hear was the faint hum of the lights. When my shift ended, I left the hospital feeling more tired than I should have been. It wasn't the work that exhausted me. It was the questions. Why was room 104 so important? Why did the manual have rules that didn't make sense? And why did everyone else act like these rules were perfectly normal? As I walked to my car, I glanced back at the building. The lights in the West Wing were still on, glowing faintly in the early morning darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move across one of the windows. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But as I started the car and drove away, I couldn't help but feel like I'd missed something, like the answers were right there, just out of reach. The next night, I arrived at the hospital early. Something about the previous shift had lingered in my mind all day, like an itch I couldn't quite reach. The rules in the manual, the patient's name on the roster, the strange noises in the West Wing. It wasn't normal. But then again, what did I know? I was just a janitor. Keating was already there, wiping down his cart with the precision of someone who'd been doing this for decades. He barely looked up as I walked in. "Back for more fun?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yep," I said, trying to sound casual. "Hey, about room 104. No, he cut me off before I could finish. "You don't need to know. Just stick to the route." His sharp tone left no room for argument. I nodded and moved on, even though my curiosity was gnawing at me like a splinter under the skin. The first part of the shift went smoothly enough. The halls were quiet and the tasks were routine. But as the clock crept past midnight, the air seemed to shift. It wasn't something I could explain, just a feeling, like the hospital itself was holding its breath. I was cleaning near the ICU when I noticed it. A door that I was sure I had locked earlier was now slightly open. Room 104. I froze, staring at the door, my mop still dripping onto the tiled floor. I knew I hadn't touched it tonight, hadn't even been down that hallway yet. But there it was. The door cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness inside. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe Keating had gone in there for something. Or maybe the latch was loose. Hospitals were old. Things broke. It didn't have to mean anything. Still, my feet wouldn't move. I forced myself to look away and continue cleaning, but my mind kept circling back to that door. Every so often, I glanced down the hall, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it stayed empty. Later, while restocking supplies in the janitor's closet, I noticed something else. One of the bottles of cleaner was missing. At first, I thought I might have misplaced it, but I distinctly remembered lining them up earlier. They were all there. The clipboard was also gone. The one Keating had handed me on my first day. Great, I muttered under my breath, trying to brush it off. Maybe someone else had borrowed them, though I hadn't seen another janitor all night. When I stepped back into the hallway, the air felt colder than before, like someone had opened a window. But this was the second floor. There weren't any windows here, just the dull hum of fluorescent lights and the faint beeping of monitors in the ICU. That's when I saw it. The name, T. Carter. It was on the patient roster again, this time underlined in red ink. My stomach twisted. Room 104 was supposed to be empty. I hadn't seen anyone go in or out, and none of the nurses had mentioned a new patient. I approached the nurses' station, my heart pounding. Nina was there, her head bent over a stack of paperwork. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Do you know who T. Carter is?" She looked up, her expression blank. "Who?" "The patient. Room 104. Her brow furrowed, and she glanced at the roster. "There's no one in 104. It's been closed for years." I pointed to the name on the list. "Then what's that?" She stared at it for a long moment before shaking her head. "That's not supposed to be there. Must be a mistake." Her voice was calm, but her hand trembled as she turned the page, hiding the name from view. I didn't press her. Something about the way she avoided my eyes told me she didn't want to talk about it. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of nervous glances and half-finished thoughts. The noises started again. Soft whispers that seemed to come from the walls, footsteps that stopped the moment I turned around. At one point, while mopping near the West Wing, I thought I saw someone standing at the end of the hall. A tall figure, motionless, shrouded in shadows. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty corridor. No response. I took a step closer, but as I did, the lights flickered and the figure vanished. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence. Finally, I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, not from the work, but from the constant tension, the feeling that something was just out of reach, watching, waiting. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the image of that open door, the missing supplies, the name on the roster. I didn't know what was happening at St. Vincent's, but one thing was certain. It wasn't just my imagination. The days were blending together, each shift starting to feel like the last. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt normal, the routine of cleaning and moving from room to room now just an empty pattern I followed without thought. But with every shift, something strange began to change. The unease had grown into something I couldn't ignore anymore. It was a quiet night, the kind that made the hospital feel like a tomb, the walls pressed in closer with every second. As usual, I was starting with the West Wing, room 104, the place that had haunted me ever since that first odd encounter. But tonight, it felt different. The hospital was silent, too silent. There were no beeping monitors, no hurried footsteps, just the flicker of fluorescent lights above me. The air smelled stale, and every corner I turned, I felt like I was being watched. Maybe it was just my nerves, or maybe it was because I hadn't had a decent night's sleep in days. But I could swear I heard whispers. The sounds were faint, like someone talking just out of earshot. Every time I paused, they stopped, but when I kept moving, they started again. I tried to shake it off. It wasn't uncommon for old buildings to creak and groan in the dead of night. Maybe it was the heating system. Maybe it was my imagination. I took a deep breath, reminding myself why I was there. There were rules I had to follow, procedures to stick to. I had done this job for long enough to know my way around. As I rounded the corner of the West Wing, I saw the door to room 104 once again ajar, just like it had been before. This time, however, something was different. The light inside the room was on, brighter than it should have been at this hour, and there was a figure inside. I froze, my hands still gripping the mop, too terrified to move. The figure was tall, standing motionless in the center of the room, staring at something I couldn't see. I wanted to call out to ask if they needed help, but my throat tightened. The figure was too still, too unnaturally still. I called out anyway. "Hey, is everything okay?" No response. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just that they weren't answering. It was the fact that I wasn't even sure if they had heard me. The figure remained rooted in place, like some kind of statue, not even shifting when I spoke. I stepped forward cautiously, my feet dragging across the floor, each step making the silence feel heavier. But just as I reached for the door, the lights flickered. A loud, mechanical clank echoed through the hall. The power in the room blinked out for a moment before returning, but the figure had vanished. Gone. I stumbled back, my heart racing. This was the part where I should have told myself to leave, to go to the nurse's station, or even just walk out of the building. But I couldn't. It felt like someone was pulling me toward that room. Something inside of me just needed to know. I grabbed the handle and pushed the door fully open, stepping into the dimly lit room. It was empty. No one was there, but the bed was not. The sheets were twisted, as if someone had been lying there only moments ago. The smell of disinfectant was overwhelming, but underneath it, there was something else, something stale, something wrong. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned, searching the room one last time, when my gaze caught something, a faint outline on the floor near the bed. It was a piece of paper, partially hidden beneath the bed. My first instinct was to leave it alone. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave without knowing. I bent down and grabbed it. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and written in a sharp, angular handwriting. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. The message was simple. They're not supposed to be here. The blood drained from my face. I felt dizzy, my legs giving way beneath me. What the hell did this mean? Suddenly, the lights above flickered again, but this time, they didn't come back on. The emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a red hue. And that's when I heard it. A whisper, faint but growing louder. "Get out. Now!" I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a violent crash. I whipped around, my heart pounding, and saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing in the hallway now, just outside the room. But this time it was different. It wasn't still. It was moving toward me. I had no time to think. The door was locked, and the lights were out. My instincts kicked in. Everything I had learned about this place, about the procedures, about safety, went out the window. I had to get out, and I had to do it fast. I bolted down the hall, my breath ragged in my chest. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows shifting, twisting in the periphery of my vision. I didn't look back, but I could feel the presence behind me, getting closer with every step. At the nurse's station, I grabbed the nearest phone and dialed security. I didn't know what I was asking for. I didn't know if I was just panicking, if I was imagining things, or if there really was something after me. But I needed someone to make it stop. "Security? What's your emergency?" The voice on the other end asked, calm and distant. My voice cracked. I had no idea how to explain this. "I need help. Something's wrong. I'm not alone." The phone went dead. That's when the power cut out completely. The building plunged into darkness. I stumbled back, feeling my way along the wall, my fingers grazing cold metal, smooth tiles, then nothing. The air was thick, suffocating. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, but I wasn't sure if they were real. I turned a corner and saw the exit sign. It was glowing faintly in the dark, guiding me. I ran toward it, my pulse roaring in my ears. I reached the door, but it wouldn't open. "Damn it!" I screamed, pulling on the handle, but it was stuck, locked. The footsteps were closer now. I turned and came face to face with the figure. The tall, silent figure from room 104, its face hidden in shadows. It raised its hand, and I froze, unable to move. "Get out," it whispered. "Before it's too late." Then everything went black. I don't know how long I was out for. When I came to, everything felt different. The sounds, the smells, the cold air. It all hit me at once. But I wasn't in the hospital anymore. I wasn't sure where I was, but the weight in my chest told me it wasn't over. I found myself lying in a hospital bed, but this wasn't the place I remembered. The walls were white, sterile, but it didn't feel the same. No one had told me how I got here. No one told me anything at all. It was like I had woken up in a place that was trying to pretend everything was fine, but nothing was fine. The doctors said I had passed out from exhaustion, a panic attack from stress. Maybe they were right. Maybe it had all just been too much. But deep down, I knew something else was wrong. The shadows still lingered in my mind. The whispers I couldn't shake. The feeling of being watched when no one was around. When they finally released me, they didn't question my version of events. They didn't even seem concerned. They said I needed rest, a few days off. So I left. I had no choice but to go back to my life, to try to forget. But I couldn't. The first night back at my apartment, I locked the door behind me and went straight to bed. But sleep didn't come. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop wondering. The figure, the door that wouldn't open, the whispers that grew louder when I was close to the truth. I lay there, wide awake, the silence pressing down on me until I heard it again. A knock at my door. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. But then, it came again. Slow, deliberate, like someone was waiting for me to answer. Couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. My pulse raced as I sat up, staring at the door. My thoughts swirled, trapped between fear and logic. I tried to convince myself it was just a neighbor, just someone who had the wrong apartment. But I knew better. Couldn't explain it, but I knew. I had to know. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and reached for the door. But before I could turn the handle, the knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Let me in." I froze. The voice was low, familiar, like something I'd heard before, but I couldn't place it. I stepped back, my breath shallow in my chest. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself to walk away, but I couldn't. My hand was already on the door. My fingers brushed the cold metal, and for a moment, I hesitated. Then something inside me snapped. I couldn't go on living like this, always wondering, always looking over my shoulder. I opened the door. Nothing. No one was there. Just the empty hallway, stretching out in both directions. No sign of anyone. No footsteps. I looked around, my heart pounding, the strange feeling of unease creeping back up my spine. But I wasn't sure anymore if it was real. Was I still in danger? Was it all in my head? Was I just imagining the whispers, the footsteps? I closed the door and locked it. But even as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, just beyond the threshold. Every time I hear a knock now, I freeze. I don't care if it's a delivery or a neighbor asking for sugar. Every time, I feel that same surge of panic, that same dreadful certainty. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and the lights flicker in the dark, I think I hear it again. The whisper, the call. I don't know what happened that night at the hospital. I don't know if I was the only one who felt it, but something changed in me. The world looks different now, darker somehow. And no matter how many times I lock the door or check the windows, I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, waiting. Ready for more chills and mysteries? Subscribe and turn on the bell. You never know what story is coming next.